So in this example, I'm going to be showing you just different ways how you can center elements on the page. So we're going to be looking at how to center it with Flex, how to center the text as well, using margins in order to do the centering of the elements, and providing you several different examples of how we can center elements on the page using styling. Created an HTML file with body and then a div, and then there's also another div nested within the main div that's got a class of main and a div with a class of output. So let's apply some styling to the page elements. I'm just going to use the regular style tags on the page. And what we want to do is we want to center that text within the main content. So let's select the output element, and we can apply the text align. And what text align will do is this will center the text within the main parent. Also, let's apply a border to it so that we can see the boundaries of that element. So solid, and let's just do solid red, and selecting the element with the class of main as well. And we'll do a border around that one with one pick and solid, and we'll make that one blue. So that provides us a way to center the text. So even if the element, the output, is resized, so let's say it's got 400 pixels available to it, that text will always be centered within the main element. So within the main element, as this one is forcing it to be 400 pixels. And we notice that the parent itself is not 400 pixels. So the best way to accommodate that for more responsive is to use a max width. So that way, you're not going to be forcing it to be 400 pixels across if you don't have the space within the browser window. And once you resize it, it will go to a max of 400 pixels. We notice that the child, the output element, is not centered within the main element. And we can accomplish the centering by using the margin auto. So let's set margin and set that margin to auto. So what that will do is that will allow us to center the content. And for margin auto to actually to work, this needs to be applied to the child. So let's set the margin auto to the child. And once again, we notice that that element is now centered within the parent. If we remove out the max width, it's going to automatically take up the full available width, and it will automatically center within that element. So let's bring this down to 200 pixels so that it displays properly within our boundaries. So within the blue main area, we don't have to apply any properties to center it. And that centering is all done within the child, which is our output element. So what happens if we set a width for the parent of 500 pixels? So now that element is always still going to be centered within the main parent. And if we apply the margin auto to that parent, now it's going to be centered within the body element, or the element that that main element class is being nested within. So applying once again the centering to that element. So if we want to center an element, we've got to apply the properties, the proper properties to that element itself. Let's also update this to be max width. So that way when we resize the page, it's going to be taking at most max width of 500 pixels. And if there's not 500 pixels across, then it will default to be 100% across. So we can center a div horizontally with FlexBox as well. So we're going to create a couple other elements here. So we can just duplicate what we have, and I'll call it main1 and output1, so that we can distinguish between the two. And for this one, we're going to apply the FlexBox to the elements. And once again, we're going to be doing the centering of those elements. So select the parent, which is main1. And I'll also apply a blue border to that one, or to make it distinct, let's make it green. So there's our green border. And then for output 1, we'll also do a one pick solid, and let's do an orange border. So that gives us that element there. For this one, I'm going to apply a margin top of 50 pixels so we get some spacing between the elements. And we want to really focus on applying the FlexBox to the child. So for the FlexBox, we need to apply it to the main container. So FlexBox is applied with the display property, and then the value would just be flex for the display property. And we see that that adjusted the element output area. And because the output 1 doesn't have a height and it doesn't have a width, let's set a width of 200 pixels, and let's also give it a height of 100 pixels so that we can better see how it's going to be moving within the main area. And I'm also going to add in a background color. So once again, we can see the entire element and where it's going to be sitting within the parent. So the parent is green and the output is, the child is going to have orange. So with flex, we apply flex to the parent. So let's set that as justify content. And we have a number of options with flex to justify content. And to center it, we can use the center value, and that's going to automatically center that content. So even as we're resizing, that content is going to end up being centered. If we want to center the text, it's the same. We need to apply it to the child or to the element that we want to apply the centering of the text. If we apply it to the parent, that will center all of the text and all of the children within the parent. So if you had other children within the parent that you didn't want to center the text in, then you could avoid adding it to the parent and you could add it to the individual elements. There's also the centering of vertically, and this can be done by setting the position to be relative and then adding in a child position to be absolute within the child, and that will allow us to center it. So if, for instance, we had a height of 50, and I'm going to add a height and a width for the parent, so we can add in, and we'll just do the same max width of 500, and for the height, let's do a height of 100. So we notice, but by default, that the element is pulled to the top. So we can update this by setting up its position. And let's set the position as relative. And then for the child, if we want to center it, we need to set its actual position. So absolute will allow us to control the position as it relates to the parent. So if we want it to move it off the top by 50%, we can move it off the top by 50%. And what actually happened is that we ended up moving it too far down. So we need to make an adjustment on the element. So for this one, the height, we know that we have a fixed height of 50 pixels. So let's set a margin top of it, and we're going to subtract 25 pixels from the top. So what happened now is that we ended up getting it vertically centered. If you want to vertically center the text within the element, so that's sitting within the output element, we can set the line height. And what line height will do is it's going to reserve the absolute line height for the element. So we can set the line height to be whatever we've got the height of the element to be. So 50 and 50, and then we're also using the margin top to center it vertically. There's also another way to center vertically, and that's going to be using the transform. So take a look at that, and that's going to be the same for what we just did, where we'll set a height for the parent, and we'll set it at 200 pixels, and set the height for the child at, as well, we'll do 50 pixels. So what's happening here is that, actually that's the other way around, so that should be 250 for the child. So what we want to do is we want to center the child element. So applying to the main element, we could set the position to be relative. And that means it's relative to its main container. And for the element that's sitting within it, we're going to set it as absolute. And that's going to move it over to the left-hand side. We don't have and once we position it absolute, you'll notice that the margin no longer works. So it's been moved over to the left-hand side. So if we want to center it, we have to adjust it because now the position is absolute. So we need to set its left position, which is going to be 50%. And we need to set its top position, which is going to be 50%. And then we need to use the transform, or we can use the transform. So this is another option, and transform and translate, where it's expecting the parameters of how much we want to translate it. So if we do a 50% and a 50% translate, that moves it over 50%. So what we need to do is actually subtract the 50% in order to translate and set it properly in the center. So that's how you can center it with absolute. So the first value here is going to be the vertical value. So that's appearing to the left. So if we had a left of 60%, that's going to move it off center. So we have to make that adjustment back to center. And that's also going to have to correspond with the value. So if we do 40 and we're subtracting 40, we actually have to subtract the same amount that we did with the position. Now with the 60%, it's not exactly the same. So you do have to adjust it and center it. So that's why we're using 50%, because 50% is straightforward half, and that actually puts it within the exact position center. Also, let's do the line height. So the line height, and this main container element is 50%. So that allows us to apply that setting. Even if we have a 20% padding, the element will still remain centered. So even if we do a transformation of it. With CSS FlexBox, you can apply the flex to center the element and apply the center for both the height and the width. So you don't actually have to use the positioning, where you can just use a pure FlexBox example. So let's add in, and we'll duplicate this and set a couple other examples here. So output 2 and output 1. And now let's select those elements. So output 2, the properties, and then for the main element, so the main 2 element, and the properties that we want to apply for that. So adding in a border for those elements, and adding in a pink border. And then also for this, I'm going to just set the background color for this element so that we can distinguish it from its parent. So that's the one here right at the bottom. And what I'll actually do is I'll take this and we'll put it up at the top before the other elements. So that's sitting there at the top as we're working with it. So let's set a height and a width. So the height can be 100 pixels. And for the child, let's add in a height. So set that to 50, as we've been using 50 for the other ones. I'm also going to add in a border and set that as a 1 pic solid black border. And then I'll update the width to be 100 pixels. So let's go ahead and use flex in order to center that element. So what we apply to the parent of the element that we want to apply the centering, and apply the flex display property to it. And then justify content. And that actually should be justify content. So we're doing a center to justify the content. So that centers the content. And if we want to set it vertically as well, we can use the align items and apply a value of center to the align items. And that actually should be align items. So that will allow us to do a centering of the element, and notice as well it's being applied to the parent. So the child itself, in this case, doesn't need to have any properties applied. And if we want to make some spacing, let's do a margin bottom of 100 pixels. So that will move the following element down and show us that this one is currently now centered. Also, let's apply the text align. So our text is centered, and that centers the text for the element. And then to vertically center the text, let's do align height. And we know that this one has a set height of 50 pixels. So that gives us several examples of how we can center elements on the page.